You are standing on the deck of the largest ship you have ever seen, and you cannot move your feet, because there are simply no more places on this deck for feet to go. It is January 1945. The temperature is somewhere below freezing, and has been for days. You are one of somewhere between 10 and 12,000 people crammed onto a vessel built, before the war, to carry under 2,000. The ship is called the Wilhelm Gustloff. You do not know it yet, but in a few hours it will become the deadliest shipwreck in human history, and almost nobody outside a small circle of historians will ever learn its name. You are a refugee from East Prussia. Behind you, a Soviet army is advancing with a speed and a fury that the German civilians in its path have been told, in whispered warnings past farmhouse to farmhouse, means one thing: run, or do not survive what happens when you don't. Ahead of you is the Baltic Sea, black and enormous, and the promise, desperate, oversold, undeliverable, that a ship can carry you somewhere the army behind you cannot follow. Here is what you do not know standing on that deck. The Wilhelm Gustloff was built in the 1930s as a flagship of the Nazi Strength Through Joy program, a cruise liner designed to give ordinary German workers a taste of luxury travel, a floating propaganda instrument disguised as a holiday. It carried vacationers to Norway. It carried them to the Portuguese coast. It was never designed to be what it is tonight, the largest sealift evacuation vessel in what would become known as Operation Hannibal, the largest maritime evacuation in human history, larger by raw numbers than Dunkirk. You do not know that packed somewhere in the ship's lower decks, among the refugees and wounded soldiers and women's naval auxiliary personnel, are the surviving crew members of Germany's U-boat submarine fleet, some of the most experienced and decorated submariners the Kriegsmarine has left, being evacuated home to crew a new generation of submarines the German Navy is desperately trying to build. The empire that once terrorized the Atlantic with its wolf packs is, tonight, reduced to loading its remaining submariners onto a single overcrowded civilian ship and hoping the sea itself provides the protection its navy no longer can. You do not know that the ship's own captains cannot agree on which speed to travel, or which lights to run, or which of two conflicting reports about the danger ahead to believe. A minesweeper escort reports possible minefields ahead in shallow water. A radio operator reports a message about approaching enemy vessels that may or may not be real, may or may not be a decoy transmission designed to produce exactly the decision the captains are now arguing about making. In the confusion, someone decides to run the ship's navigation lights on, believing wrongly, catastrophically, that showing lights will identify the vessel as a hospital or civilian ship and grant it safety under the customs of war. The lights make the ship visible for miles across black water. Somewhere out in that same black water, a Soviet submarine designated S-13 is patrolling under the command of a man named Alexander Marinesko, a submariner whose own career has been defined by disciplinary trouble, alcohol, and superiors who do not fully trust him, sent out on what many in his own command structure privately consider close to a last chance. Marinesko sees the lights. He does not know, cannot know, and by the rules of naval warfare in this specific moment has no obligation to know, exactly who or what is aboard the enormous illuminated shape moving across his periscope. He knows only that it is large, that it is German, and that in the specific brutal mathematics of submarine warfare in the final winter of a 6-year war, a large German ship is a legitimate target regardless of what it is carrying. At approximately 9 in the evening, Marinesko gives the order. 4 torpedoes are fired. 3 strike the hull. Here is the fact that should stop you before anything else about this story does. The 3 sections that take the direct torpedo strikes are, by the specific and horrifying coincidence of where refugees were packed onto an overcrowded ship, sections containing crew quarters, the ship's swimming pool, converted, in the desperate logistics of the evacuation, into an overflow shelter packed with women's naval auxiliary personnel, and lower decks where families with children had been placed because there was, quite literally, nowhere else on the ship left to put them. The ship begins listing almost immediately. Within roughly 40 minutes, it has gone entirely beneath the surface of the Baltic Sea. You are one of somewhere between 10 and 12,000 people on a ship that carries lifeboats for under 2,000. Many of the lifeboats that do exist cannot be launched at all, frozen to their davits by days of sub-zero temperatures, the metal fused solid by ice, and exactly the conditions when a functioning lifeboat means the difference between a name recorded among the survivors and a name recorded nowhere at all, because so many of the dead were never identified, their names never definitively counted, in a chaos this total and this fast. Here is what the water itself does to a human body. The Baltic Sea in late January is close to freezing. A person without a life vest, without protective clothing, submerged in water at this temperature, has a survival window measured in minutes before hypothermia and cardiac shock take the decision out of the body's hands entirely. Mothers are recorded, in the handful of survivor accounts that exist, holding infants above the waterline for as long as their own strength allowed before the cold made holding anything at all impossible. Some survivors later described a specific and particular horror, the sound of the ship's orchestra, according to some accounts, continuing to play as the evacuation began, the same grim tradition of maintained order in catastrophe that would later become mythologized, differently, aboard a different, far more famous ship 33 years earlier. Nearby vessels, smaller escort ships, a torpedo boat, whatever the scattered evacuation fleet could redirect in time, began pulling survivors from the water within the hour. It was not nearly enough. Estimates of the total number of people aboard the Wilhelm Gustloff that night range as high as 10 to 12,000, because no complete manifest was ever compiled and the chaos of a wartime evacuation moving faster than paperwork could track it. Estimates of the dead, using the most widely accepted modern historical calculations, sit between 9,000 and 10,000 people. The Titanic, in April of 1912, killed approximately 1,500 people, and became one of the most famous disasters in the history of the world, the subject of songs, films, museums, a permanently recognizable cultural shorthand for maritime catastrophe. The Wilhelm Gustloff killed 6 times that number in a single night, and for decades afterward, almost nobody outside Germany and the former Soviet Union had ever heard its name. Here is why. The ship sank in the final winter of a war started by the regime whose propaganda program had built it. The dead were overwhelmingly German civilians, at the exact historical moment when the Allied nations who would go on to write most of the war's popular history had very little institutional or cultural appetite for centering German civilian suffering, regardless of its scale. In the Soviet Union, Captain Marinesko's sinking of the ship was, for years, treated with the same ambivalence, a genuine wartime military action, technically defensible under the rules of engagement of the time, that nonetheless produced a body count so overwhelmingly civilian that celebrating it as a triumph sat uneasily even within Soviet naval command. Marinesko was not decorated as a hero for the sinking. He was, in the years that followed, demoted, and it was not until decades later, after his death, that the Soviet state posthumously recognized him at all. The largest maritime disaster in recorded human history does not have a museum wing. It does not have a blockbuster film. It has, instead, a small number of survivor accounts, a handful of historians who have spent careers trying to establish an accurate death toll that will likely never be exactly known, and a wreck resting on the floor of the Baltic Sea that some later diplomatic and legal disputes have specifically classified as a war grave, off-limits to casual disturbance, in acknowledgement of exactly how many people are still down there. You were on that deck. You could not move your feet. The lights that were supposed to protect you were the reason you were found. And somewhere below, in water cold enough to end a human life in minutes, the deadliest night in the history of the sea unfolded in the space of about 70 minutes, witnessed by almost no one who lived to describe all of it, remembered by almost no one who wasn't already looking for it. And this was only the beginning of what the retreat from the east would cost.